This lesson is R-7. It is comparing functions. This comes from chapter 4. So last week, we talked about how to get a rule from a table. We also last week talked about how to get the equation of a line. So now we're taking those two lessons and cramming them together and figuring out and using the information in a slightly different way. So when we take a look at your table, what we need to do to compare the two functions, notice that we have function A, which is the table, and we have function B, which is the graph. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert the graphs or tables to y equals equations. We want our things to look like y equals 2x plus 1, or y equals -1/2 x minus 2, or things like that. That's what we want our equations to look like. So two little vocabulary words that are a little bit different now that we're talking about functions. Rate of change. Rate of change is the same thing as your slope. Your rate of change is that number that goes in front of your x. That's the same thing as your slope. The initial value, your initial value is the same thing as the y-intercept. It's that plus or minus after your x, all right? So those words are just slightly different than what we were doing before. They still work and operate all the same way though. So taking a look at the table. Last week, we looked at a table and we came up with the rule for the table. Now we're coming up with the equation for the table. The rule and the equation are the same exact thing. So we always have our y equals and we always have our x. No matter what, when we're going to do these equations today, you always have your y equals, you always have your x. So when we're taking a look at our table, just exactly the same way that we did it last week, you have to take a look at the pattern going down the y. So our x's go by 1, so we're just looking at the pattern going down the y. Remember that if our x's went by 2's, remember we would have to use subtract, divide. But since our x's go by 1's, we just have to look at the pattern going down the y. So to get from 3 to 1 to -1 to -3 to -5 to -7, what are we doing each time? Well, we're subtracting by 2. So that -2 goes in front of your x. The same way that we did it last week as well, to get your plus or minus, when x equals 0, whatever your y value is your plus or minus. So when x equals 0, y is -1. So we have a -1 here. So when you go to find your rate of change is just the number that's in front of your x. So that's the -2. And your initial value is your plus or minus after the x. So that's going to be -1. When we take a look at our graph, your rate of change or your slope, the top number is how many you go up or down. And then the bottom number is how many you go over to the right. So this is always written as a fraction, the rate of change, which is the number in front of our x. So going from left to right, just like you read a sentence, going from dot to dot, we're going down 1 over 2, down 1 over 2, down 1 over 2. So our slope or our rate of change is -1/2. Negative because we're going down. Positive would be going up. So now the second thing is your plus or minus after the x. Well, where does the line cross the y-axis? Your initial value is your y-intercept. It crosses right here at 2. So this is going to be a +2. So again, your rate of change is the number that's in front of your x. So that is -1/2. Your initial value is your 2. Now we have some questions to answer about the two functions. Remember, this is function A and this is function B. So which function has a higher rate of change? So we're looking and comparing a -2 and a -1/2. The more negative a number is, the farther away it is from 0 on the number line, the smaller that number actually is. So your higher number here, -1/2, is really negative 0.5 as a decimal. That one is bigger than negative 2. So what I'm going to write here is the letter B. For your initial value, which function has the higher initial value? So now we're comparing a negative 1 and a positive 2. A positive number is always bigger than a negative number. So your positive number is bigger. So again, this is going to be B. Are they always going to be the same letter? No, they're not. That's just a coincidence. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So taking a look at the next kind of question, in this one we had a table and a graph. In this next one, we have a graph and we have an equation. So you're going to have your y equals and your x again, because we always have that. So taking a look at our graph, just like we did before, your number that goes in front of your x is your slope. How many you go up or down, and then how many you go over to the right. We always go over to the right, just like we read a sentence. So for your rate of change, going from dot to dot to dot, we are going up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. So we can put 2 over 1 as a fraction. Now, technically, do you have to put that as a fraction? Could you just put a 2 instead? Sure, you could. Then we have our y-intercept. Where does the line cross the y-axis? The line crosses the y-axis right here in the middle at 0. So technically we have a plus 0 after the x. Now, technically you could put plus 0, technically you could put minus 0, or the more mature way, if this was a multiple choice question on your state test, they would just say y equals 2x. All right. The more mature way would be to not write the 0. Your rate of change. Your rate of change is the 2, or you could put 2 over 1. Either way is fine. And your initial value is 0. When you have an equation, all right, when you have an equation, all that you have to do is recopy that equation. All right. It's already in equation form for you. So all that you have to do is put the 3 in front of the x and your minus 5 after it. All right. They sort of do the work for you. Your rate of change is the number that's in front of your x. So that's going to be 3. Your initial value is your plus or minus after the x. So that's going to be negative 5 because of the minus 5. When we go to answer the questions, which function has a lower rate of change? So we're comparing a 2 and a 3. 2 is lower than 3. So this is going to be function C. Which function has a lower initial value? We're comparing a 0 and a negative 5. Negative 5 is lower than 0. Any negative number is lower than 0. So this is going to be D. You will have 6 of these type of questions on your homework today. The next type of question that you're going to have on your homework, last week we did graphing lines. Today, what you're doing is you're graphing functions. We literally do them the same exact way. If you think back to when we did this, remember that f of x just means y. So this is just your x and this is just your y. Your numbers in Class Kick today will be chosen for you already. You'll have a 0, 1, and 2 already in there. So all that you have to do is that same thing, just like graphing lines last week. You're taking your values for x and subbing them in for x. So remember, when a number and a letter are next to each other, that means times. So this is really 2 times x plus 1. So instead of 2 times x, you're going to have 2 times 0 plus 1. Instead of 2 times x, you're going to have 2 times 1 plus 1. Instead of 2 times x, you're going to have 2 times 2 plus 1. Whatever your answer is, you just have to put in that y or f of x column. So 2 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. When you go to graph these, just like you graphed lines before, Your X value is always how many you go over. Your Y value is how many you go up. That's a U, up or down. Remember that when we graph points, we always start from graphing right there in the middle at 0, 0. So the first point that we want to graph is 0, 1. Starting in the middle, over to 0, up to 1. Put a dot. Our next point is 1, 3. Starting in the middle, over to 1, up to 3. And then we have 2, 5. Starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 5. Connect the dots, put your arrows, and you should always label your line. If you take a look at that bottom question, it says, is this linear or non-linear? A lot of times on your state test, they like to ask questions like they'll give you pictures of graphs and they'll say, which of the following is linear or which of the following is non-linear? Well, if it forms a straight line like this one does, a straight line means that it is linear. Linear means that it forms a straight line. So you'll have 2 of these questions on your homework today as well. Take a look at the last example. Now, this last example, notice that we have an x squared in our equation. Anytime that you have an x squared, this is going to be a U-shaped graph. That U-shaped graph is non-linear because it's U-shaped. So notice that they chose already for you -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. We're going to sub those numbers in for x. Now, be very, very careful. Pay very close attention right here. This is extremely important. When you go to sub in negative numbers, if you think back to when we did this during normal school year, anytime that you're subbing in a negative number in for your x squared, you have to type it inside parentheses. If you don't type it inside parentheses, you will get the wrong answer every time. So when we have the -2 squared and when we have the -1 squared, you have to type it inside parentheses in the calculator if you're using a calculator. Then we have a +1. 0 squared +1. 1 squared +1, and 2 squared +1. The positive numbers and the 0, you don't need to type it in parentheses. Would it be wrong if you did? Nope, it'll be fine. All right. And then just like the previous questions, you're going to put your answer in the f of x column. Remember that that f of x column is just your y column. So -2 squared is really -2 times -2, which is +4. +1 is 5. -1 squared is -1 times -1, which is +1. +1 is 2. 0 squared is 0 times 0, which is 0. +1 is 1. 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. +1 is 2. And then 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. +1 is 5. Notice the pattern that we have. If you remember back to when we did this, your first number and your last number always have to be the same. The second number and the fourth number always have to be the same, because that way it will form your perfectly symmetrical U-shaped graph. So again, when we go to graph it, your X value is how many we go over. Your Y value or f of x value is how many you go up or down. So when we go to graph this, again, we always start graphing our points from right in the middle. So our first point is -2, 5. Starting in the middle, over to -2, up to +5. -1, 2. Starting in the middle, over to -1, up to +2. 0, 1. Starting in the middle, over 0, up to 1. 1, 2. Starting in the middle, over to 1, up to 2. And 2, 5. Starting in the middle, over to 2, up to 5. Notice how this forms a perfect U-shaped graph. Always make sure that you put your arrows on the ends, and you should label your graph as well. So again, this one is non-linear because it forms a U shape. What makes it a U shaped is that x squared in the graph.